Hello, welcome to the New York Public Library. My name is Salvatore Scabona. I'm the Weinberg Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, in which you are right now. The offices are next door. I invite you to silence your cell phones. As some of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, access to our collections, and a stipend so that they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, fiction writers, and poets at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections at this library to write the books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999, and we are now hosting our 26th class of fellows. Tonight we present David Greenberg's monumental biography of Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. The Times Book Review said of it when it came out, right before naming it one of the notable books of 2024, that John Lewis, A Life, is panoramic and richly insightful. This biography sets a new standard by giving Lewis's post-civil rights story the depth of attention it deserves and showing how our mild-mannered seminarian submerged his pacifist tendencies enough to succeed in the bare-knuckled world of electoral politics. David worked on his biography during his fellowship at the Cullman Center from 2021 to 2022. He'll discuss the book with New Yorker's staff writer Nicholas Lemann. After about 35 or 40 minutes, they'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. Staff members will pass along along the outside aisles at about half past to collect your questions. Copies of John Lewis, A Life are for sale in the hall. David has agreed to sign your copy for you after the presentation. Nicholas Lemann has worked as a reporter and editor at the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New Yorker, where he's been a staff writer for 25 years. From 2003 to 2013, he was dean of Columbia Journalism School, where he continues to teach. His books include The Promised Land, The Great Black Migration, and How It Changed America, a New York Times bestseller and winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Transaction Man, Traders, Disruptors, and the Dismantling of Middle-Class America, and most recently, Higher Admissions, The Rise, Decline, and Return of Standardized Testing. David Greenberg is a professor of history and journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. He's the author of Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image and Republic of Spin, and Inside History of the American Presidency. Formerly acting editor of the New Republic and then a columnist for Slate, Greenberg now writes regularly for Politico, Liberties, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He's received fellowships and awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Leon Levy Center for Biography, but most importantly from us. Please help me welcome David Greenberg and Nicholas Lemann.
Okay, well, thanks for being here, David, and thanks for giving us this wonderful book, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to sort of take a little bit of liberty because we're at the Cullman Center to be allowed to talk about the author as well as the subject of the book, which we in nonfiction don't get so often. So let's just start by telling us, how did this book happen?
Well, this is often, if you know, if you hadn't asked it, it's often a question I get from the audience.
I didn't say personal journey, by the way.
Right,
So,
exactly. I'm not on the psychoanalyst couch, but it started in the middle of what is now regrettably the first Trump administration, and it was 2018 or so. I had finished another book and was casting about for a new project. And it's a bit hard to realize now because John Lewis, even in his final years, kind of ascended to a certain iconhood. And but at that time, it was he was just someone who I kept noticing popping up in the news, commenting on this, being a spokesman for that. Not quite a leader of the resistance exactly, but someone who people were kind of turning to for moral authority, for commentary, for historical perspective. And it occurred to me almost like in a eureka moment, there was no biography of John Lewis. And I think there are certain reasons for this. I sort of came to see that his, that iconic status he achieved, I think came about, as a character in Sun Also Rises says about going bankrupt, two ways, gradually and then suddenly. And so, John Lewis was more and more becoming a person whose historical achievements were getting recognized, but it was only toward the end that you thought, oh my God, this guy deserves a book. And, this was also the years, it was before 2020, but we were still having, a lot of discussion about America's racial history, our struggle to overcome racism as a country. And although I'd written many books on American history, I hadn't written one in which race was really at the center of the story. And I think as a historian of American politics, you'd agree, and most historians would agree, that race is very much at the center of the American story. And so I wanted to approach that subject too, and John Lewis's life seemed a way to do that.
So the question that sort of inside the Beltway question that biographers ask each other, where's the material? How much archive is there? Where is it? Who'd you interview? What was that process like?
Yeah, so the first challenge was getting to John Lewis himself. I wanted his blessing to write the book, and I also thought, honestly, I would get a better advance if I had it, or I'd be more likely to get a contract if I could say, yes, John Lewis is cooperating. And so it took me forever to get through to him. He really has a kind of palace guard around him. And, one thing I came to see, and I don't say this cynically, is that there was very much a concern among his staff with, the John Lewis legacy and the John Lewis image. I had written books. My first book was on Nixon's image, and then I had done a book on presidential spin. And at first I thought, oh, this will be nice with John Lewis. I'm writing of a man who's so authentic and sincere, and to get away from all those questions about image making. But actually that was wrong, that he's a politician, and he too and his staff were very much concerned with that kind of thing. So I finally get an appointment with him. It's in February 2019. He's just done the coin toss at the Super Bowl in Atlanta. And the next day, he's getting on a plane to go to Los Angeles to do the Oscars, to introduce Green Book, which wins Best Picture. And I'm sort of wedged in there on a Friday afternoon. And there I am, finally face-to-face with John Lewis. I ask for his blessing to write the book. He gives it. And I say, okay, what do I do for the rest of the hour? Because I wasn't even sure this was going to go forward. And then later that year, he learned he had pancreatic cancer, and there wasn't much time left. And then we had COVID. So I did have a few phone interviews with him during the pandemic, but for the most part, he himself was not the source. And yet, there was a tremendous amount of archival material available, much of which hadn't been looked at all, or some of which, for example, the papers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the civil rights organization that he led in the 60s, those papers had been looked through, but never through the eyes of someone writing about John Lewis. So in the chairman's files, I find these letters from John Lewis's mother that, didn't make their way into the histories of SNCC. I discovered there were, the papers of John Lewis weren't available. They're still in boxes in his house and, who knows where. But there were papers of Lillian Lewis, his wife, who is really an unsung, untold part of the John Lewis story that I try to tell for the first time in the book. And then I also, as you know, I'd been a journalist before becoming a historian. And one of the pleasures of writing contemporary history, which is a phrase I picked up from John Lewis, who said this was his favorite thing to read, was what he called contemporary history of the recent past, is you get to use the tools of the historian and the journalist. You get to do the archival stuff, and go through all the old newspapers, but you also can interview people. And I interviewed something like 275 people, and some of them just had a remarkable amount of material. I mean, I remember here at the Cullman Center having lunch with an old friend of John Lewis's from SNCC who had had seen in like a byline, a tagline in something I'd written that I was writing this book, and had called me up. He was in New York visiting from, I think, Ohio, and he had a whole sheaf of letters, that just were gold. Another guy I found named Archie Allen, who had been with John Lewis in Nashville as students in the 60s. He had worked for John Lewis for 7 years at the Voter Education Project in Atlanta in the 70s, worked with him in the Carter administration. He had even started a biography of John Lewis and had done interviews with John Lewis's parents. He had interviewed long since dead civil rights people like Ella Baker and Septima Clark. And he, at one point then in the 80s, decided to become a chiropractor and moved to Santa Barbara. So I'm calling him up, and he starts agreeing to talk to me. But at first he's like, well, I'm still thinking of writing my biography. So not getting that far. And then he's starting to tell me stories, starting to tell me people to talk to. Well, maybe we could co-write this book. Maybe we could. Well, Archie, I don't think that's going to happen. And then finally one day he calls me up and he says, can I have your credit card number? He says, I'm at the post office. I have 3 banker's boxes full of material I want to ship to you. So will you pay for it? I said, sure. I gave him my credit card number. And this was also a gold mine. I mean, John Lewis's birth certificate, his high school transcript, his acceptance letter to college. I don't know about you, but my college acceptance letter did not say, we hope it is in God's plan that you come to study with us, as he went to seminary. So anyway, long story short, it was really this mix of interviews, archives, interviews leading to archives, archives leading to interviews, and the interplay of these tools of the historian with the tools of the journalist that, for me, really made this an exciting book to research and write.
There's so much to talk about that we're only going to scratch the surface. So you should all definitely read the book. But one thing I want to ask you about is the relationship between being a social movement person and being a real-world politician who runs for office. In my own life, there was a phase in the 80s when I was interviewing a lot of these older civil rights leaders. And, I remember once interviewing somebody who pops up in your book a little named James Bevel. And he was in Chicago in a storefront, organization, like nobody ever came in. A lot of those people just, they were at the center of American history and they just faded. And Lewis himself went from being at the center of American history in every possible way to being like a third echelon functionary at a foundation. It's a different skill set, it's a different sense of timing. So there's a lot of that in the book, and I'd just like you to reflect on it a bit.
Yeah, and I frame the book with 2 parts. First part is protest, and second part is politics. And that takes its framing from a famous article by Bayard Rustin, the civil rights activist, who wrote an article called From Protest to Politics. Around the time of early 1965, we passed the Civil Rights Act. We were about to pass the Voting Rights Act. And everybody was talking about, where does the movement go from here? And Rustin's answer was, run for office, young man. And it was kind of saying to people like John Lewis, as well as many others who go into politics, Julian Bond, Marion Barry, for better or worse, a whole lot of them come to see politics as the next frontier of the civil rights movement. And there are interviews with John Lewis in the 70s and 80s where he's saying just this. he gets questioned. Well, you used to be this outsider attacking the establishment. Now you're working with the establishment. And he would say, I see this as a continuation of my civil rights work. And of course, it required different tactics, sometimes different attitudes, even you could say a different code of ethics. Sometimes what is palatable or permissible to a politician, is anathema to an activist. One thing he did, you ask about these jobs, he had this really amazing ability to recognize his own strengths and also his weaknesses. So he would take these jobs running, say, the group, the Voter Education Project, which was a group that was after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. There were still millions of black voters across the South who weren't registered. Some of that was due to kind of lingering racist, white supremacist efforts to keep them from voting. Some of it was more learned patterns of passivity, of not bothering to vote. And the previous person who held that job was Vernon Jordan, who was an attorney, very skilled, young African-American attorney who used that job to kind of push out grants and John Lewis used the job to go around the South and sort of preach and rally people and inspire people and go to union halls and pool halls and churches. And he just changed the job into something else. Same thing when he goes into the Carter administration. He's the #2 at an organization called Action, which is an umbrella group for volunteer groups like the Peace Corps and Vista. And he quickly realizes he's not an administrator. He doesn't want to administer. He finds a good #2 person to do all that, and he goes around the country, talking to people in all the local offices. And even as a congressman, people would say to me, he wasn't such a legislator. Well, he did have some notable legislation, but more important, he used his leverage and his moral authority as John Lewis, again, to go around the country, talk to people, to figure out if I put my name on this bill, it's going to help attract these other people, and to sort of figure out what he could do well to make a job that might not have been a natural fit for him into one at which he could excel. And it was really a remarkable sense of his own strengths and weaknesses, again, that I think led him to be able to do this.
Well, let's go at it from the other door. I mean, what I hear you saying is, as a politician, he behaved like a movement guy.
Right.
So as a movement guy, did he behave like a politician? That is, when we think about social movements, we don't think about people who try to be practical and compromise and so on. I mean, I was fascinated one little moment in the book for civil rights addicts. There's this famous thing that happened where Lewis, at his speech at the March on Washington in 1963, had a line in the draft that we're going to march through the South like Sherman marched through Georgia, and that he was persuaded by Rustin and others to take that out and tone it down. But then I find from your book, I don't know if you were the first to say this, he didn't even write that line.
Right.
Somebody else wrote it for him and talked him into putting it in. So how much of the sort of compromise and practicality side of politics was he doing in his movement days?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, because he was always very much attuned to the politics of things. I mean, maybe not right at the beginning, where he certainly had the fervor of someone who was always ready to march. And there's sort of one great story where, he's just a 20-year-old kid, and he and his fellow students at American Baptist, which included James Bevel, by the way, and for this tiny Bible college, a whole lot of the great civil rights leaders came out of that little group. And there were others at Fisk and other Nashville universities. But they all wanted to march, but there had been word that they were going to be met with really bad violence, and the police had been told that day to kind of look away for the first 5, 10, 20 minutes. And the ministers, who were sort of the leaders, counselors, mentors to these young students, kept saying, we don't think you should go downtown today. And John Lewis kept saying, "We're going to march." And one of the ministers said, "You know, John, I'm hearing a lot of pride in you." He starts giving him kind of a Christian guilt trip about his, flawed character. And John Lewis said, "Well, all of that may be true, but we're going to march." So he was known as, and certainly could be, determined and principled and uncompromising and sometimes stubborn in a way that colleagues found excessive. I mean, I really have tried not to write a hagiography, and he could be frustratingly stubborn. And yet, pretty early on, he develops these political antennae. And the March on Washington speech is a great example, because he had written this speech kind of in concert with others in SNCC who were taking a much more critical and adversarial line toward the Kennedy administration's civil rights bill than were the other partners, the NAACP, Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, and A. Philip Randolph, for whom, it was a day of protest, but they were excited that Kennedy had finally gotten behind it. They wanted this day to be kind of a triumphant day. And the folks at SNCC were, not down with that. And Lewis writes, with their help, this very hard-hitting speech. Again, right, others contribute lines. We're going to march through the South the way Sherman did, to which John Lewis adds, "nonviolently," which is kind of an oxymoron, but he had to put that in because he was so true to the creed and the belief of nonviolence. And then when King and Randolph and Rustin are sort of, arguing with him, negotiating with him to tone it down, I think he actually pulls off a pretty neat trick, which is he gives them a lot of what they want. And the Archbishop of Washington wants certain things taken out, or he's not going to do the benediction. And so he gives them a lot of what they want. But if you look at the speech, it's still a hard-hitting speech. He still ticks off the flaws in the Kennedy bill. And he really kind of gets to have it both ways. And even the write-ups the next day in the paper, a lot of them focus on the militancy, as it was called, of his speech. Some give priority in the newspaper to his speech over King's "I Have a Dream" speech. So I do think you see a political sensibility there. And then just a few years later, he's actually seen as too accommodationist, as the whole zeitgeist is moving in a more radical leftist tradition. Black power is getting embraced by a lot of people in SNCC. They come to see John Lewis as too willing to work with power, too eager to participate in this upcoming Lyndon Johnson White House Symposium on Civil Rights, too fond of Martin Luther King, who had become kind of not a favorite of many people in SNCC. So there were lots of ways in which even the young John Lewis shows the political side, even as the political John Lewis retains the protester within.
In the second half of the book, when he is a politician, there are some parts in which he makes these kind of wrenching decisions that politicians have to make. I'll just tick off two or three. And, they're more wrenching in his case because of his moral authority. Meaning no disrespect to other politicians, but
they don't all have moral authority.
You just don't think, oh my gosh, Mitch McConnell betrayed hundreds of thousands of people who believed in him. So I'm thinking of his decision to run against his close friend, but that ended, Julian Bond, for the same congressional seat. I'm thinking of him voting for the 1994 crime bill.
Well, he voted against it, but he voted to allow it to come to a vote.
Or just,
Right.
Kind of deeply ambivalent. His deep ambivalence about who to support in the 2008 presidential election. So do you see the way he handled those situations as consistent with the younger civil rights version of Lewis?
I think so. It seems petty to sort of complain about a rave review, but in Brent Staples' review that Salvatore generously quoted from, he had one line about Lewis becoming an apparatchik. He used the word, and I thought, that's not really right. I mean, he did become a part of the Democratic Party leadership and was close to Democratic speakers, starting with Tom Foley and going through Nancy Pelosi. But he would also go his own way when he thought that was appropriate. And he was never a purely political animal who I don't think you could ever accuse him of selling out. But politics does confront politicians with difficult choices that those of us watching at home often, don't have to make. So we can be critical, either position, whatever they strike, but we're not really facing it. And I think to take the Obama-Hillary race is a really good one. I think I kind of reconstructed that as closely as anyone had, and even talked to some of the reporters who were putting that story together. Basically, in short, I'm sure you remember the race, but Lewis was very excited about Barack Obama and the prospect of his becoming the first black president. But he was also very close to and very fond of both Bill and Hillary Clinton, had been someone, invited to the White House a lot, had been really an advisor to Bill Clinton. And he also thought, as much as he respected Barack Obama, he was a brand new senator, very untested at a time, where America's position in the world was starting to seem precarious. And he really thought Hillary was the better candidate. And so after refusing to endorse, he gets off the fence and supports her. But then Obama surprises everyone, not only wins the Iowa caucus, which we remember, but then won Georgia, which was his home state, and won it on the strength of the black vote. So now Lewis is coming under all this pressure from below to change his endorsement. There was also this issue of superdelegates, right? These were elected officials, including all members of Congress, who could vote at the convention. And it was thought, what if, one candidate wins the regular delegates, but the other candidate wins the superdelegates? That seems unfair, and the superdelegates put the other person over the top. So they were saying as a superdelegate, he had an obligation to support Obama. I mean, never mind that Ted Kennedy, his constituents voted for Hillary, but he wasn't getting pressure the other way. It was all mixed up. Then I discovered there was kind of this secret pressure campaign. I still couldn't quite figure out who was behind it. But suddenly, negative stories about John Lewis, like an age discrimination case in his office the previous summer that had never been reported on, suddenly appears in the Atlanta newspaper. So it's like, what else do they know? What else might they leak? And so there's that kind of pressure. He gets a primary challenger for the first time in a long time. But then there's also the positive draw, which is he sees the bandwagon for Obama. He wants to be a part of that. He's drawn to Obama. Lillian, his wife, says that Obama reminds her of the young John Lewis. Not sure how much, but, the sense of a movement there. And so after much agony, he changes his vote. And I talked to Bill and Hillary Clinton about it. I talked to John Lewis's people about it. He eventually says, when he decides to announce this flip, he does an interview with Andrea Mitchell, who was like his favorite TV reporter. And he says to her, making that decision was harder than the decision to proceed and march over the bridge at Selma. And she says, but Congressman, you had your brains bashed in. He said, in the case of Selma, there was a clear right and wrong. And this, I had loyalties on both sides. I had arguments on both sides. And I think that kind of gets at the difference and why I do think the younger John Lewis, the man of principle, is still there. I mean, these decisions are not always congruent. And there are some decisions where there is a clear right or wrong and you have to pay a price for it, but you're going to do it. I mean, I think about when, almost alone among the Congressional Black Caucus, he refused to support the Million Man March and was willing to condemn Louis Farrakhan. And that was just a case of moral conviction. But in other cases, it's politics. And, there's no exact right or wrong, and every decision has upsides and downsides. And he often did agonize, but he learned to be a politician.
Do you feel like it's possible to state what his sort of core moral principle was that would predict the various decisions he made? Where was the red line, or where was the guiding star, or whatever metaphor you want to use?
It's hard to say there's, I don't think any of us lives by such a clear-cut absolute code that we can just hold up every moral or political decision against that standard and have it dictate. Maybe AI will figure out the moral algorithm for us. But, there were certain principles. I think one was nonviolence. And, you see this at the end of his life. Sort of two of the final public acts of his are very interesting. One is an appearance at Black Lives Matter Plaza, which now ceased to exist, been repaved over by Trump's people. This, had been newly painted, a section of Washington Street, near the White House, anointed Black Lives Matter Plaza. And Lewis, despite being very frail and ailing with his cancer, gets up 4 a.m. on a Sunday to go up to a hotel balcony and take pictures with Black Lives Matter in the background, and then goes down and starts to see people, everybody in their masks because it's still COVID. But at the same time, in that moment, I forget if it was a few days earlier or a few days later, there's actually some very ugly violence and rioting in Atlanta. And by this point, he's down in Atlanta. And he gets on TV and, very gently, but chides these protesters and saying, violence is never the path, that history has shown nonviolence to be a much more effective way of bringing about social change. And he's able to articulate both of those principles, in his final days. And I would say the other principle that he always held to was a kind of racial universalism. The belief, which animated his struggle against segregation, but that also, say, led him to speak out against Farrakhan and others, and that had led to his split with the Black Power crowd, people like Stokely Carmichael, that of course race as sort of a factor in people's cultures, people's background and experience was important and was not something that should be ignored. Ultimately, he wanted to represent his white constituents as well as his black constituents. He believed whatever social change was going to come had to be achieved by an interracial coalition. Again, this comes from Rustin, as well as King, but when thinking about legislatively, more from Rustin. And I think you do see those principles consistently throughout his career. So he could be very partisan, but he could also be very bipartisan. And so long as he felt he was in some sense working toward, he liked to use this phrase that comes out of the social gospel, the beloved community. So long as he was working toward the beloved community, he was moving in the right direction.
I want to ask you a little bit about his early life. I guess the way I'd put it is, we love in America to talk about people who come from humble backgrounds. He really came from a humble background. I mean, much more than King and many of the major civil rights leaders. How did he get where he got from, talk a little bit about how he grew up and then how he was able to move so far from where he grew up, how he grew up.
Yeah, I mean, the poverty that he was born into was just remarkable. And one of the interviews that Archie Allen did, I mean, more than an interview, this guy Archie Allen did over 10 years, hundreds of pages of oral history with John Lewis. And so you're hearing it directly from John Lewis, a lot on the childhood, because Archie also grew up poor. and he talked about the outhouses and like using corn cobs. He talked about bathing in the zinc tub. When he gets to college at American Baptist, it's not just the first time he's had his own bedroom, it's the first time he's had his own bed. He always had to share a bed with like two brothers. There were 10 kids in the Lewis family. So it's really a deep level of poverty. And that was partly what drove him to seek something better. I mean, between the economic oppression and the racial oppression of the Jim Crow system. What's really interesting is, how many people didn't. We still need to explain why is he moved to become this prominent activist, because his brothers and sisters, they supported and admired him, but they didn't go down that path, and so many others didn't. I really think, well, the move toward activism is there early, and as a teenager, you see him, lobbying the school for better buses because he sees that the white school has like nice new buses, whereas his school bus gets stuck in the mud and he gets home after dark, and this always happens. There's these mini protest actions that he deeply resents the inequities of the system he's living under. So the qualities are there, but then when he gets to Nashville, it's right when the movement is flowering, and under the tutelage of a minister named Kelly Miller Smith, who's one of his professors, who leads the big Black Baptist church in town, and a divinity student named James Lawson at Vanderbilt. I had the privilege of talking to Lawson, who died last summer at 94, and he said, when John Lewis came, he was already ripe, was the word he used. That Lawson was an apostle of nonviolence, who King said, people say James Lawson has, learned nonviolence from Martin Luther King, but King said, no, James Lawson knows this better than I do. Lawson had been to India, really deeply imbibed and believed the Gandhian nonviolence, satyagraha, as it was called, soul force. And I think it was that environment, as a very, these formative years, 18, 19, 20 years old, with Lawson, Kelly Miller Smith, these other folks like Diane Nash, James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, collectively, they're sort of forged with this deep belief. I mean, King had it and others had it, but many people I interviewed from the movement said nobody had it to the depth that John Lewis did. It was just to the core of his being. And I think that was what fueled him, took him out of the poverty of rural Alabama, took him to Bible college, took him into the movement, took him to Congress.
We're about to go to audience questions. So I know that cards have been passed out, but if you want to fill out a question card, please do, and they'll be brought up to me. So I'm running out of the ability to ask my own questions when I have a million to ask. But just if I can pick out one thing to ask you to sort of recount from the book is a little bit about SNCC. When Lewis started out in the movement, there was no SNCC. How did SNCC start? What was it supposed to do? Why was there a need for a new organization? And then how did it fall apart? And a little bit on the story of the leadership struggle within SNCC that led to Lewis leaving the head position. Right.
Okay. I'll try not to use up all of our time remaining on SNCC. But SNCC's a very important organ and vessel of the civil rights movement. It begins in the spring of 1960. This is the season of the lunch counter sit-ins. And sit-ins were a tactic that had been used actually a lot before, but in late winter of 1960, first a few students in Greensboro, but then these Nashville students begin sitting in, black and white students together actually in Nashville, at Woolworth lunch counters, McClellan's department stores. All the five and dimes had these like dinettes where you could order a hamburger or a fountain drink, and they were segregated. Black people weren't allowed to sit there. And this sit-in movement sweeps the South. It even starts sweeping the North, where you didn't have segregated lunch counters, but people would, in solidarity, picket a Woolworths or what have you. And often credit goes to Ella Baker, who's an important leader of the movement. But it was also James Lawson, the man centered in Nashville, who decide we need to get all these different groups of college kids together because there's so much going on. And the original idea, as the name of the group suggested, was a coordinating committee. So let's get the kids from Atlanta, the ones from Nashville, the ones from Greensboro, the ones from here and there, and we'll have a big conference and we'll meet every so often to try to bring our campaigns into some alignment so we're all working toward common goals. Well, very quickly, SNCC gets ambitious. They start taking on other projects, voter registration organization, what we would call community organizing in the rural South, in Mississippi, and Southwest Georgia, and Arkansas, and becomes sort of a full-fledged organization unto itself. And now the students are graduating. So there's still some students in it, but it's less a student and less a coordinating committee. And then at the end, to jump ahead, when they go to Black Power, people joke, it's not nonviolent either. So it's the non-student, non-coordinated, violent, not nonviolent committee. But from the beginning, there are different impulses, right? There are the very deeply religious people like John Lewis, for whom nonviolence is a religious commitment as well as a political, philosophical one. There are others for whom it's merely a tactic. They recognize the value of having cameras or reporters capture the experience of white thugs beating you up on a bar stool when you're trying to get a hamburger and winning the sympathy of white America. But it's only a tactic. And there are other differences within SNCC too. But for several years, as they're working toward these common goals of things like desegregation, of like a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, they're able to hold this group together for all its diversity of thought and philosophy. And it's actually, I give credit not to John Lewis, but to a man named James Forman, who was about 10 years older than these younger activists, and he was the executive director. So John Lewis was the chairman starting in '63. He would go around the country, give speeches, be inspiring. He took part in many a rally and a protest, but Forman was the administrator, the guy who did the nitty-gritty and kind of held the thing together. Again, by the time after these laws, these major milestone laws in American history are passed, and the movement is sort of searching, what do we do next? What are the next challenges? There's no more consensus. It's much harder to hold the group together. Some people are getting more radicalized. Some people want to work with the Johnson administration, which for all its faults, they see as a good faith partner on the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Bill. And John Lewis is starting to worry that these things he believes in so deeply, including integration, including nonviolence, are sort of slipping away. And so in 1966, he kind of hears these rumors that other people are going to run for chairman, but decides he wants to run again. And again, he's the political John Lewis. Yeah, partly I think he likes power. He likes being chairman. But he also feels that he needs to be chairman to keep SNCC on the true path. And so they have a retreat at a place called Kingston Springs outside Nashville. Church retreat, kind of wooded area with like a long mess hall with sort of pine walls. And on the final night, there's the elections for the new officers. And there's a very contentious argument about what the direction of SNCC should be and who should lead it. And he's challenged by Stokely Carmichael, who comes from, born in Trinidad, but comes from New York, went to Bronx Science, grew up in a much more integrated background than John Lewis. Very different politics, sees this primarily as a struggle about power, not about morality. And to John Lewis's surprise, he actually wins re-election. And people kind of, cheer and talk and start milling about. People go back to their bunks. But others remain. And then a former SNCC worker comes in and says, "What? You guys re-elected John Lewis?" And the whole conversation gets opened up again. Somewhat different people there. This time the argument's even angrier and more contentious. John Lewis gets very upset. He sort of refuses, to kind of go along. So James Foreman says, we're all going to, resign, all of us who've been reelected, and we'll have a new vote. Well, Lewis doesn't want to go along with this. This makes him seem even more intransigent. And there is a re-vote, and this time he loses. And, for a few weeks, very dutifully, he kind of goes along with the new regime and says, oh, no, there's no change in direction, just sort of changing of the guard. But within a few weeks after that, he leaves SNCC, as do many of the other figures from, whom we remember, Julian Bond and Robert Moses, and SNCC, within a year is sort of a shell of its former self. And it's a very painful and traumatic experience for John Lewis, one that I think stays with him years later. So, you mentioned, we haven't really discussed his race against Julian Bond for Congress in the Democratic primary of 1986. I think he was kind of thinking in 1986 back to 1966, thinking, I'm not going to let them take it away from me again, and because a lot of people were lining up with Julian. So I think for both historic reasons, Kingston Springs and his departure is really important, but I think also for personal reasons, for reasons of the biography, it's a really pivotal moment.
So let me now go to some of these questions that I have. So we don't have tons of time, so we'd like to do sort of semi-lightning
round. Okay.
What have you done or will you do with the personal papers given to you?
I am going to hold on to them for now. Archie actually asked for his back, so I had to double my credit card bill and send those back. Although I made some copies, although I wish I had made more copies. The other gentleman who I met here, Brian Park, said you can keep them, and wherever you eventually donate these, you can donate mine with them.
Can you speak to the influence of India's independence movement on John Lewis's beliefs and philosophy of protest?
Well, certainly, yes, very important. Gandhi's experience and Gandhi's leadership and model of nonviolent resistance was pervasive in at least this circle, this quarter of the civil rights movement. And Lewis read Gandhi. He read biographies of Gandhi. He compared the Selma to Montgomery March of 1965. He was always comparing it to Gandhi's March to the Sea. So he had, it was very much in his consciousness. He never went and studied there, although he almost did at one point, and James Lawson had, and he thought of trying to do the fellowship that Lawson had, but decided he wanted to stay in Nashville. So, I don't know that it was a deep commitment or study, but it was definitely an important influence.
Okay, next question. You mentioned that Lewis's wife, Lillian, was an important figure your book aims to do justice to. Can you say more about her impact and their relationship?
Yeah, I'm glad that was asked. In 1968, after leaving SNCC, kind of mucking around for a couple years, not sure what he's doing, Lewis goes to work for Robert F. Kennedy, the real Robert F. Kennedy, and on his presidential campaign. And he finds in Kennedy sort of the hope that maybe now we can get back on track, because the late 60s were a very disorienting and troubling time. And he's with Kennedy in April 4th, the night that Martin Luther King is assassinated. And Kennedy, as people may know, gives this extemporaneous kind of beautiful speech to kind of calm the very angry and upset, mostly black crowd that he's speaking to. He's also with Kennedy, or he's there in the Ambassador Hotel 2 months to the day later, June 4th, when Kennedy is assassinated. So here his hero is murdered. The man who's kind of taken up the mantle of his hero is then murdered. Lewis is at like an all-time low, and he actually checks into the hospital for depression. And he's just started dating Lillian. And he's never really dated anyone before, seriously. Not that anybody can find any record of. And Lillian's coming every day, bringing him his mail, bringing him his newspaper, and very unromantically, he proposes to her from the hospital bed. And one friend of John Lewis's, a Georgia congressman named Buddy Darden, who held the next district over, said, you know, you can't understand the second act of John Lewis's life without understanding Lillian, because she's the one who gave him the confidence to believe in himself, to eventually run for office, to believe he could and should run against Julian and defeat Julian. She wanted him to run for speaker. Her faith in him was limitless. And she also was disciplined and organized, where he was not. She could be the bad cop, could fire people who had to be fired where he could not. She was really an indispensable part of both his personal life and his political life. And she was very, press shy, press averse. So not much was written about her in her lifetime. But I talked to a lot of friends, and she's a real character in the book.
And I'd add, she basically didn't like Washington, was never in Washington. Right. So she was sort of in Atlanta, and he was in Washington going back and forth. And that may have helped shore up his position in Atlanta, that she was there representing him at all times.
Yeah, and she said in one interview, because he got called the Saint in 1975. He's featured in a Time magazine cover story, Saints Among Us. And at one point she says, well, the saint isn't around so much to take out the garbage, but he does his share. And
okay, you mentioned that Lewis went to seminary school and preached around the country as a politician. Can you speak about the influence of his faith?
Yeah, it really comes from his faith. As a boy, it's a very religious family, especially his mother. He's ordained as a boy minister. At age 14, I think, he gives his first sermon to his church. And so his church is his life. And the religious commitments, I think, are really deeply entwined with his commitment to human equality. And again, in SNCC, this becomes a point of conflict, because the later wave of SNCC leaders are not particularly religious. Even perhaps some have some contempt for the religious orientation. Now, later in life, I talked to one chief of staff who said, well, look, I don't know how much he went to church on Sundays. Sundays in Washington are for the shows, Meet the Press and, all those shows that were on Sunday morning. And you don't see, there's obviously a preacherly style that he has and a certain moral fervor in his rhetoric, but you don't see him playing the preacher, except one incident I found was really fascinating, and I had not remembered this at all. The day after 9/11, Congress calls on him to give a prayer to the entire Congress assembled in the rotunda. And he really, it's not political at all. It's full-on preacher, oh God, who holds us in your hand. And you can watch it on YouTube. It's really remarkable. So that religious feeling is still very much there.
Okay, next question. How did the expression "make good trouble" come about?
I like this question, because it was a marketing social media gimmick that they came up with. It's, again, when I say the story of John Lewis is one of image making, not to say he's inauthentic, you can't say that about John Lewis, but you look at the early rhetoric, he's using phrases like beloved community. When I sign books, I don't write good trouble, because it was kind of this thing they cooked up later on. what he really liked to say was keep the faith, keep your eyes on the prize. There are a whole bunch of things he loved to say. But, at a certain point, he, along with his sort of social media guy, who then became his co-author, Andrew Aden, with whom he did these graphic memoirs, the March trilogy in the 2010s. These were memoirs about John Lewis's early years in the movement, done in, cartoon style, that he wanted to write in order to reach children. And Andrew they came up with Good Trouble as kind of a hashtag, and then Lewis began working it into every interview he did and every speech he gave, and very much by the end of his life, this was associated with him. And for those who don't know it, the idea was his parents would always say, stay out of trouble. When he first gets arrested at the sit-ins, they're all upset, getting in jail. This is going to be the end of him. Very religious people. But he said sometimes it's necessary to get into trouble, to make trouble, as he would say, good trouble, necessary trouble. And that became kind of his catchphrase.
Okay. All right, so here's a nice, easy one. Given where we are today, where do we go from here?
Right. So the one train you can get a block over, if you're going to the east side, you'd go, look, this is always a question, and I say, don't look at me. I'm just a humble historian biographer. If I knew the answers, I'd be running for office or something. So all I can really say is that John Lewis, again, in the first Trump term, did seem to have a kind of superpower, as they say now, an ability to sort of provide people with a certain amount of solace, comfort, inspiration, and hope. And there's one story I tell in the book. It's right after Trump wins the first time. It's a big surprise, I think, as it was to most of us. And this woman's feeling quite despondent. She's walking through the Atlanta airport, where John Lewis spends a lot of time going back and forth. And she sees John Lewis getting a shoe shine and walks over to him. And he steps off the pedestal and comes down and gives her a hug. And he loved to hug. And there was something almost holy or religious about touching John Lewis. It was like touching the hem of his garment. I mean, it seemed to have this magical effect on people. And this woman walks away, and she later tells a reporter, after that, I knew I was going to be okay. And look, I don't know that we're going to be okay, but I do think his life, his way of living his life, and his example. I mean, he was born into America that, especially if you were a black person in 1940s Alabama, was a worse America than we have right now, and found a way to find hope and, in the words of the song, to overcome. And he always believed that we could overcome and that we shall overcome. And he maintained this kind of incredible hope. There's actually one moment, just a quick story, after the Republicans win the big win in 1984 and take over the Congress for the first time in 40 years, a staff member comes to him the next day, knowing his kind of inveterate, upbeat spirit, and says, Mr. Lewis, please tell me there's a silver lining in here. And he says, Debbie, there is no silver lining. But then others said, within a few days, he was back at it. He was the one leading the fight against Gingrich. And I think he always chose hope. And I say choose because optimism is a disposition or a temperament. But hope is a choice, at least as John Lewis saw it. It was the deliberate decision to translate your belief in a better future into action to get you to that better future. And I think if he can be an inspiration and he can be a source of hope, it's to encourage us all to find that for ourselves.
I have one more, and we're almost out of time. But with respect, we respect John Lewis for his civil disobedience as a student. How will the future view student protests today?
Well, as I say, I'm a historian, so I do the past, not the future. You know, John Lewis believed that protest was, you know, an essential right, an essential freedom, an instrument of change. He also believed fundamentally in nonviolence, and he often had conflicts with his fellow protesters who wanted to take a more violent approach. He was a big believer in what now kind of gets derided as respectability politics. That is to say, he and his friends would put on their Sunday best, coats and ties, dresses, when they did their sit-ins or their marches. The idea was to be beyond reproach. And if you were arrested, you willingly went to jail. You know, if you broke the law, you accepted the punishment because that was a way of illustrating the immorality of the existing law and the argument that it had to be changed. So he believed in protest, but he also believed in certain kinds of protests and was less thrilled about other kinds of protests. So it's very hard to say, you know, in any given instance, protests today, you know, I think there would probably, like I said about the Black Lives Matter moment, there was much that he found inspiring and hopeful about what this new generation of activists was doing and pointing toward. And there was also aspects of it that worried him and that he maybe had flashbacks of 1966 and worried that the movement might be headed in the wrong direction. And so, I don't know, I imagine he would have a similarly complicated take on it today. But, you know, it's not my job to ventriloquize the dead. I can only speak of what John Lewis did do and did say, not what he might have thought.
Okay, well, that winds things up. Thanks, David, for being here. Thanks to all of you for being here. It was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
And there's
Books to sign.
books for sale outside. David will sign for you, and so please buy many copies. Thanks.
All right, thank you.